"She's too old. She's not what we ordered. This is going to cause problems." These words, overheard through a hotel room door on her wedding night in Paris, would reveal the horrifying truth. The fairy tale romance was a lie. The loving fiancé was a predator, and the elaborate 2-year courtship had one purpose: to trap her in an international trafficking ring. This is the story of how one woman's dark secret became the weapon used against her, and how her courage exposed a network that had destroyed countless lives. Priya Sharma never imagined that her fairy tale would turn into the worst nightmare of her life in a matter of hours. At 26, she had achieved everything a young Indian woman could dream of: a degree in business administration from the University of Mumbai, a promising job at a German multinational, and most importantly, the love of Thomas Weber, a 32-year-old German engineer. Priya and Thomas's love story seemed straight out of a romantic movie. He was immediately fascinated by the young Indian woman's beauty and sharp intelligence. She, in turn, saw in him not only a romantic partner, but a gateway to a completely new life in Europe, far from the suffocating expectations of her traditional family in Delhi. The relationship blossomed quickly. Thomas visited India 3 times in 2 years, charming Priya's family with his genuine interest in the local culture. The marriage proposal took place in December 2023, during Priya's 3rd Christmas in Germany, a romantic dinner overlooking the Rhine in Cologne, followed by a walk through the Christmas market where he knelt in the snow and offered her a diamond ring. Wedding preparations began immediately. Priya's family insisted on a traditional Hindu ceremony in Delhi, followed by a Western celebration in Paris, which Thomas had chosen as the most romantic place in the world to begin their honeymoon. But in the months leading up to the wedding, Thomas showed an unusual interest in the details of Priya's past life. He asked specific questions about her previous relationships, her college friends, and especially her social life in Mumbai. At first, Priya interpreted this curiosity as a sign of his deep love. But there was something about Thomas's questions that began to bother her. He seemed particularly interested in a specific period of her life, the 2 years she had spent working in Mumbai before moving to Germany. Priya began to realize that he had researched her on social media much more thoroughly than he had initially admitted. Old photos she had forgotten, comments on posts from friends from years ago. Everything seemed familiar to him. The Hindu ceremony in Delhi was spectacular. 3 days of traditional festivities with hundreds of guests. Thomas participated in all the rituals with apparent enthusiasm, wearing traditional attire and following the instructions of the Hindu priests. But Priya noticed some strange moments during the celebration. Several times she caught Thomas discreetly photographing specific guests, always when he thought no one was looking. She noticed that he paid special attention when former colleagues from Mumbai came to greet her. The flight to Paris took place the day after the festivities in Delhi ended. The Hôtel Le Meurice on Rue Rivoli had been chosen by Thomas for its classic elegance. The presidential suite offered a spectacular view of the Tuileries garden, and Priya felt like a princess as she entered the luxurious surroundings. The Western party was scheduled for the hotel's main hall with 50 guests from Germany and some close friends of Priya's who had flown in from India. It would be a more intimate celebration, but no less important. The afternoon before the party, while Priya was resting after a spa treatment, Thomas left, saying he needed to take care of some last-minute details. He seemed more nervous than usual, constantly checking his cell phone. Priya took advantage of her husband's absence to call her best friend Meera, who had stayed in Mumbai. During the conversation, Meera mentioned something that made Priya's blood run cold. In recent days, some former co-workers had approached her asking for specific details about Priya's personal life in Mumbai, claiming that a German journalist was researching a story about Indian professionals working in Europe. The questions were very specific and included details about relationships, social life, and even financial aspects. Even more worrying, the alleged journalist seemed to know intimate details about Priya's life that only those very close to her knew. As she listened to Meera, Priya felt a chill. The pieces of a sinister puzzle began to fall into place. Thomas's insistent questions about her past, his strange behavior during the wedding in Delhi, and now this mysterious investigation. What exactly had Thomas discovered about her? And more importantly, what did he intend to do with this information? When Thomas returned to the room 2 hours later, Priya was sitting in the armchair by the window, still wearing her spa robe, but with a completely different expression on her face. For the first time since they had met, she looked at Thomas and saw a stranger. Thomas entered the room with a different expression. The forced smile he had maintained all day finally disappeared, replaced by something much more sinister. He locked the door behind him and walked slowly to where Priya was sitting. "We need to talk," he said, his voice laden with a coldness she had never heard before. "About Mumbai, about Vikram Malhotra, about what you really did in those 2 years before you moved to Germany." The name hit Priya like a punch in the stomach. Vikram Malhotra was a chapter of her life she had buried deep, something that belonged to a past she had literally run away from to the other side of the world. How had Thomas found out about Vikram? "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, but her voice trembled. Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. He pulled his phone out and began swiping through the screen. When he found what he was looking for, he turned the device so she could see. It was an old photo from 2021, taken at a corporate party in Mumbai. Priya was in the background, chatting animatedly with a well-dressed, attractive, middle-aged man. Vikram. "This photo was posted on Instagram by a former colleague of yours, Rohini Das," Thomas said. "I believe she was very helpful when I explained that I was doing a surprise for my future wife, documenting her past life as a wedding gift. People are so naive when you make up a romantic story." Priya felt her hands tremble. Thomas had manipulated people from her past to get information about her. "Rohini told me some very interesting things about you and dear Vikram," Thomas continued, pacing back and forth like a prosecutor. "How you became his protege very quickly after being hired. How you suddenly had access to confidential company information. How you started wearing expensive clothes and jewelry that definitely didn't match your trainee salary." Each word was like a blade cutting through the defenses Priya had erected around that period of her life. "But the most interesting part," Thomas continued, "was when Rohini told me about the scandal, about how Vikram Malhotra, married for 20 years and father of 2, was found dead in his apartment. About how the initial investigation suggested suicide, but then it turned out that several fraudulent contracts had been signed using his identity. About how a significant amount of money had disappeared from the company's account. And about how you, dear Priya, simply disappeared from the city 2 weeks later, claiming to have gotten a job in Germany. The room spun around Priya. Thomas had found out everything, not just her relationship with Vikram, but also her connection to his death and the missing money. "The question is, my dear wife," Thomas said, sitting on the bed and studying her face with cold curiosity, "did you kill Vikram Malhotra because of the money you stole together, or did you kill him because he was going to report you to the police?" Priya realized that he had been planning this moment for months, perhaps even since the beginning of their relationship. The whole love story, the romantic proposals, it had all been an elaborate trap. "Thomas, you don't understand," she began. "Vikram he wasn't who you think he was. He threatened me, blackmailed me. I was trying to get out of that situation when you killed him," Thomas finished. "Yes, I figured that would be your version of the story." "The real question," Thomas said, standing up again, "is what I'm going to do with this knowledge. You see, I could just call the German police right now. I'm sure they'd be very interested to know that a fugitive from Indian justice has been living illegally in Germany for 2 years. Priya swallowed hard. Thomas had concrete evidence that could completely destroy her life. "But I'm a reasonable man," Thomas continued, "and it just so happens that I have a proposal for you, one that could be mutually beneficial for both of us." Thomas's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and smiled. "Ah, perfect timing. This is Klaus, my business partner. He's arriving at the hotel now for our meeting before the party. You remember him, don't you?" Priya felt the blood freeze in her veins. Thomas's mutually beneficial proposal was starting to become clear. When Klaus knocked on the door 15 minutes later, Priya was still sitting in the same armchair, paralyzed. Thomas opened the door and warmly greeted a short, middle-aged man with gray hair and small eyes that immediately fixed on Priya with disturbing intensity. "So, this is the famous bride," Klaus said in English with a thick German accent. "She's even more beautiful than in the photos. Thomas, you've done an excellent job." Klaus's words confirmed Priya's worst fears. She wasn't a wife, she was a product. Klaus sat down in the chair opposite Priya, studying her with the eyes of someone accustomed to evaluating merchandise. Thomas poured whiskey for both of them, acting as if they were having a normal business meeting. "Explain to her how it works," Klaus said to Thomas, taking a tablet out of his briefcase. "It's best that she understands completely before the party starts." Thomas sat down on the edge of the bed. "You see, Priya, over the past 18 months, Klaus and I have developed a very lucrative business. We identify young, attractive women with complicated pasts, women who, for various reasons, cannot turn to the authorities when they find themselves in difficult situations." Klaus unlocked his tablet and began swiping through the screen, showing photos of at least a dozen different women. All were young, beautiful, and clearly of different nationalities. "Our clients are very wealthy men with very specific tastes," Klaus continued. "They pay extremely high prices for exclusive company, especially when that company has specific physical and cultural characteristics that they cannot easily find in Europe." Priya felt nausea rising in her throat. What they were describing was human trafficking, and she was being groomed to become the next victim. "The difference in our business model," Thomas said, "is that we don't kidnap anyone. We create situations where the victim cooperates voluntarily, at least initially. Marriage is the perfect tool. Legal, romantic, It creates emotional bonds that can be exploited. Klaus showed more images on the tablet, official documents, marriage certificates, visas. Once the marriage is official, we have significant legal control, especially when the woman is in a foreign country without a support network and with legal issues in her home country. The brutal truth hit Priya like an avalanche. They had specifically identified her because of her vulnerability, an immigrant with a criminal past, isolated from family and friends, desperately dependent on her legal status in Germany. "But you're making a mistake," Priya said, finding courage she didn't know she had. "I didn't kill Vikram Malhotra, and you have no real evidence that I committed any crime." Klaus and Thomas exchanged a look. "Interesting that you mentioned that," Klaus said, turning his attention back to the tablet. "Because in fact, we know exactly what happened to Vikram Malhotra." He turned the tablet so she could see the screen. It was surveillance video, clearly low quality, showing the hallway of an apartment building. The date indicated it was recorded in September 2021. "This video was obtained through unofficial channels," Klaus explained. "It shows you entering Vikram's apartment on the night he died. But more interestingly, it shows you leaving 40 minutes later, carrying a suitcase that you definitely didn't have when you arrived." Priya felt the world spin. The video existed, real evidence of her presence in Vikram's apartment on the night of his death. "The suitcase contained money," Thomas continued, $300,000 US that Vikram had withdrawn from corporate accounts in the days leading up to his death. Money that you brought with you to Germany and used to establish your new life. "You don't understand," Priya said, her voice breaking. "Vikram was blackmailing me. He said he would ruin my career if I didn't continue sleeping with him. The money it was compensation for what he did to me." "Perhaps," Klaus said, closing the tablet. "But that's an explanation you'll have to give to an Indian jury, assuming you survive the extradition process and the years in Indian prison awaiting trial." The threat was crystal clear. They had physical evidence that could result in her conviction for murder. "So, here's our proposal," Thomas said. "You can cooperate with us. Show up at the party tonight. Smile for the photos. Then tomorrow you come with us to meet some very special clients who are eager to make your acquaintance. You will be well treated and receive a percentage of the payments. And if I refuse, the video and all documents related to Vikram Malhotra's death will be handed over to the German and Indian authorities tomorrow morning. You will be arrested, extradited, and likely spend the rest of your life in an Indian prison for murder and theft." Klaus stood up, putting the tablet away. "The choice is yours, but it must be made now. The party starts in 2 hours, and our first clients arrive in Paris tomorrow." Priya looked at the two men who had systematically destroyed her life and realized there was no real escape. "If I agree," she said finally, "how do I know you'll keep your word?" Thomas smiled, but there was cruelty in his expression. "Because, my dear, dead women don't make money. You're worth much more to us alive and cooperative than dead and useless." When the door closed behind them, Priya finally collapsed. But as she cried, a part of her mind began to work. Thomas and Klaus had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed she was completely defenseless. They didn't know about the small dagger she always carried hidden in her purse, a reminder of the dangerous days of her youth in Mumbai. If she had to attend the party, perhaps she could find an opportunity to turn the tables. The main hall of the Hotel Le Meurice had been transformed into a fairy tale setting. To any outside observer, it was the perfect celebration of true love. No one could have imagined that the bride was being forced to play the role of her life while desperately plotting her escape. Priya stood in front of the bedroom mirror, wearing the white and gold silk sari she had chosen months ago. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the traditional Indian jewelry, gifts from her family, that now seemed like golden chains. Thomas knocked and entered without waiting for permission. "It's time," he said, offering his arm. "Remember, honey, smile for the cameras." As they descended into the hall, Priya mentally catalogued each person present. There were approximately 50 guests, but she also noticed faces she didn't recognize. Older, well-dressed men who watched with unusual interest. "The observers there," Thomas whispered in her ear, "are investors in our business. They want to see the quality of our product before placing future orders." The symbolic ceremony was torturous. Priya recited vows she had written when she still believed the words she was saying. Each promise of eternal love turned to ashes in her mouth. During dinner, Priya was introduced to Thomas's investors. They were middle-aged to elderly men, all extremely wealthy. They spoke to her politely but appraisingly, commenting on her beauty, her education, and her docility. One of them, a burly Arab named Rashid, was particularly blunt. "She will be perfect for my client in Dubai," he said to Thomas, as if Priya were not there. "When can we arrange the transfer?" Throughout the conversation, Priya kept a forced smile, but her right hand rested on the small handbag where the dagger was hidden. She had made a decision. She would not leave that hotel alive if it meant becoming a sex slave. Around 11 p.m., most legitimate guests began to leave, leaving only the inner circle of Thomas, Klaus, and the investors. It was then that Klaus approached her with 2 glasses of champagne. "To the radiant bride," he said, offering one. Priya accepted the glass, but did not drink immediately. There was something about the way Klaus was watching her that awakened all her survival instincts. She pretended to drink, but kept the liquid on her lips. "Drink," Klaus insisted, his voice carrying a veiled threat. That's when Priya realized the champagne was drugged. They planned to sedate her. "Of course," she said, raising her glass. "But first, let me make a proper toast to my wonderful husband." She turned to Thomas, who was talking to Rashid nearby. "Thomas, dear, come here. I want to make a special toast to you." When Thomas approached, Priya raised her glass. "To the man who completely changed my life," she said, her voice laden with irony only she could perceive. And then, in a quick, fluid motion, she threw the contents of the glass in Thomas's face and ran toward the hall exit. But Klaus had anticipated escape attempts. 2 large men immediately blocked the main doors. She turned, looking for another exit, but realized she was trapped. "We really hoped you would be more cooperative," Thomas said, wiping the champagne from his face. "But if you want to make this difficult, we can accommodate that." Klaus signaled to the security guards, who began to slowly approach Priya. That was when she made her final decision. If they wanted to take her, they would have to fight for it. Priya quickly opened her purse and pulled out the small dagger, holding it up so everyone could see it. The metal glinted in the hall lights. "Stay where you are," she said, her voice firm for the first time in hours. "I'm not leaving this hotel with you. If you try to force me, I swear that at least one of you won't leave here alive." Rashid laughed. "A kitten with claws, that will make things more interesting." But Thomas wasn't amused. If she made a public scene, the entire carefully orchestrated plan would fall apart. "Priya, be reasonable," he said. "You know you have nowhere to go. Even if you escape, we still have the video." "Maybe," she replied, keeping the dagger pointed at him. "But at least it will be my own choice, not your sick plans." It was at this moment of maximum tension that something unexpected happened. Klaus's phone rang, and when he answered it, his expression changed dramatically. "We have a problem," he said to the group. "The French police are in the hotel lobby. Apparently, someone made an anonymous report about suspicious activity." Priya felt a wave of hope. The arrival of the police completely changed the dynamics. "If the police come up here and find you holding a knife," Klaus said, "who do you think they'll believe? We have 50 witnesses that you attacked your husband." "And I have a very interesting story to tell them about human trafficking and blackmail," Priya replied. "I'm sure they'll be fascinated to hear about your investors." As the other investors fled through a side exit, Priya realized there was only one way out alive. She had to bet everything on one last desperate move. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. With the dagger still in her hand, Priya made her decision. "Klaus, Thomas," she said, her voice taking on an authority that surprised even herself. "You have a choice now. Let me leave, or explain to the police why a bride is armed at her own wedding party. Do you really think you'll be able to get out of here?" Thomas laughed nervously. "We still have the video from Mumbai." "Actually, Thomas, you made a fatal mistake," Priya said, pulling her cell phone out with her free hand. "While you were explaining the whole criminal scheme, I was recording everything, every word about human trafficking, every name of the investors. It's all here on this phone." Klaus's expression changed completely. "You're bluffing." Priya tapped the phone screen, and Thomas's voice began playing. "Our clients are very wealthy men with very specific tastes. They pay extremely high prices for exclusive company." Thomas moved toward her, but Priya raised the dagger. "One more step, and I'll scream for help." It was at this crucial moment that the doors opened, but instead of the French police, the person who entered was someone Priya never expected to see again. Mira, her best friend from Mumbai, accompanied by a man in a dark suit. "Priya!" Mira shouted, running toward her. "Thank God you're okay. This is Inspector Dubois from Interpol. I told him everything." Thomas and Klaus's world collapsed in seconds. Inspector Dubois showed his ID and immediately took control. "Messieurs Weber and Richter, you are under arrest on suspicion of international human trafficking and blackmail. We have been investigating your activities for several months." Klaus tried to run, but 2 other Interpol officers blocked his escape. Thomas stood frozen. Priya lowered the dagger, finally allowing herself to believe the situation was under control. "It's not over yet," Mira whispered in her ear. "There are things you need to know." Inspector Dubois approached Priya. "Madame Sharma, I must inform you that we also have matters to discuss regarding Mumbai." Thomas made his last desperate move. "She's a murderer. This woman killed a man in Mumbai and ran off with $300,000. I have proof." Inspector Dubois didn't seem surprised. "Yes, Mr. Weber, we are aware of the Vikram Malhotra case. In fact, that's why we're here." Priya felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, but Mira held her hand tightly. "Priya, listen to me. After you left for Germany, Vikram's family hired private investigators. They discovered things about him that changed everything." Inspector Dubois opened a folder. Madame Sharma, Mr. Vikram Malhotra was being investigated by several agencies for financial crimes and sexual blackmail of employees. What you experienced with him was not an isolated case. There were at least 6 other women he was blackmailing simultaneously. Priya could barely process the information. But the video. I was there the night he died. Yes, you were, confirmed Inspector Dubois. But the investigation revealed that Vikram Malhotra died of an accidental overdose of heart medication mixed with alcohol. He was trying to simulate a heart attack to emotionally blackmail you, but he miscalculated the dosage. Mira continued. The investigators uncovered his entire system. He secretly recorded intimate encounters, forged financial documents. The money you took was actually rightfully yours. Payment your company owed you that he had embezzled. The irony hit Priya like a tsunami. For 2 years, she had lived with guilt and fear for something that was not a crime at all. Vikram had died because of his own greed, not because of any action on her part. And Thomas had built his entire elaborate scheme based on a false premise. Klaus, handcuffed, shouted one last threat. This isn't over. We have people waiting for her in 3 different countries. Inspector Dubois smiled. Actually, Mr. Richter, your investors are already being arrested in simultaneous operations in Dubai, Frankfurt, and London. Priya finally understood. You knew about their plan from the beginning? Not exactly, Inspector Dubois admitted. We were investigating the trafficking ring, but we didn't know specifically about you until your friend Mira contacted us 2 weeks ago. Mira squeezed Priya's hand. I knew something was wrong when that supposed journalist started asking very specific questions. So I started my own investigation and discovered the connection to Thomas. As Thomas and Klaus were led out in handcuffs, Priya finally collapsed into a chair, the dagger falling from her trembling hand. It's over, Priya, Mira said. Really over. You're free. Inspector Dubois approached. Madame Sharma, I know this is a lot to process, but I will need you to come with us to give your official statement. We will also arrange protection for you over the next few months. Priya looked around the destroyed hall, wilted flowers, extinguished candles, the wreckage of what should have been the happiest day of her life. But for the first time in 2 years, she breathed truly free. Inspector, she said, rising with new determination, I am ready to tell everything. It's time to make sure these men can never do this to any other woman again. 6 months later, the trial of Thomas Weber and Klaus Richter had ended. Thomas was sentenced to 15 years in prison for human trafficking, blackmail, and international conspiracy. Klaus received 18 years. During the trial, the full extent of the operation emerged. Thomas and Klaus had married at least 12 different women over 3 years, using false identities. Some victims were never found, presumably sold to networks in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. 3 other surviving victims testified alongside Priya: Anastasia from Ukraine, Elena from Romania, and Chen Wei from China. The stories were terribly similar but also inspiring. Each had found the strength to resist, to survive, and to help justice prevail. Priya had to deal with the full revelation about Vikram Malhotra. The investigation uncovered that he had systematically blackmailed at least 20 women over 5 years. Vikram's family eventually sought her out to apologize. The most surprising aspect was discovering her own strength. For years, Priya had seen herself as a victim, but the process of confronting Thomas and Klaus of testifying in court, and of helping other victims had revealed a resilience she didn't know she possessed. She and Mira were planning to start an NGO to help women in similar situations. Priya was also writing a book about her experience, which had already attracted interest from multiple publishers. She had become an active speaker at conferences on human trafficking and migrant women's safety. Each time she spoke, she saw faces in the audience, young women who might be at risk, professionals who work with victims, policymakers who could implement change. The most rewarding aspect was receiving letters from women who had recognized signs of danger in their own relationships after hearing her story. A young Romanian woman wrote that she had broken off an engagement after realizing her German boyfriend was asking suspicious questions. An Indian student in London sought help after recognizing emotional blackmail patterns. Personally, healing had been complex. Priya was still in therapy, working through the trauma, but there was progress. She had started dating David, a fellow criminology student who knew her whole story, but treated her simply as Priya, not as a victim, not as a survivor, just as an intelligent woman building a meaningful life. As she reviewed the manuscript for her book in a Berlin cafe, Priya reflected on the title she had chosen. The Bride Who Never Was, How I Survived a Human Trafficking Trap. Her phone rang. It was Inspector Dubois. Priya, we have good news. The operation we carried out in Thailand based on information from the Thomas Klaus case rescued 17 women. Some had been missing for years. Your testimony was instrumental. Priya smiled for the first time in months without conscious effort. Her story had begun as a personal tragedy, but it had turned into a tool for systemic change. Thomas Weber had tried to destroy her life, but he had inadvertently created one of the most powerful voices in the fight against international human trafficking. The bride who never was had become the woman she was always meant to be.